So I truly appreciate those of you that are staying for the talk. Those who are not, I completely understand. I have about 15 minutes to give you a dose of exponential espresso to open the way to our terrific panel discussion on artificial intelligence, its impact to societies, ethics, rule of law, and nations. Now, I want to talk to you about this anticipating future issues that are going to be facing our world. And I want to begin actually with a question of who knows what that's a photo of? Yes? It is a pale blue dot. For those who do not know, it's what Carl Sagan described our planet when this photo was taken by Voyager 1 back in the 1990s. Actually, Voyager 1 had traveled 4.3 billion miles away. And at that time, when it had reached that, it had taken 5.5 hours for sunlight to be reflected from our planet to Voyager 1, and another 5.5 hours for radio waves to beam the image information back to reconstruct that photo of our planet. Now, it's worth thinking about how the world has changed since Voyager 1 was launched, since it took that photo, to where we are now, just to give you a sense that this is not linear change, this is exponential. Voyager 1 launched in 1977. For those of you who are around, there was about 4.2 billion human beings on the face of the planet. GDP for the world was about 7.2 trillion US dollars. And if you remember, the Apple II went on sale with a whopping 4 kilobytes of RAM, which would be enough to play maybe about 1 or 2 or 3 seconds of an MP3 file nowadays. By the time Voyager 1 has traveled the distance to take that photo, we're now looking at about 5.3 billion human beings on the face of the planet. GDP has tripled. Windows 3.0 goes on sale, so a nod to Chris and Microsoft for the first time ever. And also at that point in time, a young Tim Berners-Lee turns on the first web server ever in December of 1990. Now, any guesses as to how many web servers, just web servers, are on the face of our planet now? Do I hear 10 million? 100 million? A billion? What if I told you more than 1.3 billion web servers are on the face of the planet? And that actually, the last 500 million came online in the last 18 months. That's not linear change, that is exponential change. I'm going to pause real quick in 2013, because that will be a day that I think we'll go back and look at that year and realize we made history without even realizing it yet. There were 7.1 billion human beings on the face of the planet, and about 7.1 billion network devices also on the face of the planet. Now, obviously not equitably distributed, but that was the point in which we will start to see more network devices on the face of the planet than humans, and growing at an exponential rate. Also in 2013, again, GDP had tripled at that point in time, and there were about 4 zettabytes, 4 billion terabytes of data on the face of the planet that year. To give you context, some have said that just the text holdings, so just the text holdings for the Library of Congress is about 10 terabytes. So when I talk about 4 billion terabytes, I'm talking about 400 million versions of the Library of Congress's text holdings on the face of the planet. Now let's fast forward to 2022, less than 5 years from now. Estimates by 2022, anywhere between 75 and 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet, relative to only 8 billion human beings. The good news is our population is not growing exponentially, else we'd really have problems. GDP is anybody's guess. There will be about 7 billion human beings online. Right now, a little bit less than half the planet is online. Now, that's an optimistic figure. At a later date, we could probably have a conversation about whether or not we'll achieve that, or if some nations might actually say, I'm not sure I want my entire population connecting to the internet because of the consequences that come with that. In terms of data, since this is a data summit, we're looking at 96 billion terabytes, 96 zettabytes of data on the planet, which according to some is more data than all human eyes see on the course of the planet in a year. Another estimate, it's twice all the conversations we've ever had as a species times 2. At that point in time, searching by keyword will no longer work. How many of us go past the 3rd or 4th pages of search results when we use our search engines? We will be drowning in data. We will miss things that could be great opportunities. We will miss things that could avoid bad things from happening. And that's probably already starting to happen for both private sector and public sector enterprises now. So, with that context, who knows what this is a picture of? Anyone? Yes? It is a printing press, specifically the Gutenberg printing press. Who knows what this is a photo of? It is a map of broadband internet connections, so broadband connections only, circa 2014. And I share that because it's worth pausing for a moment and recognizing that the printing press predated the Treaty of Westphalia and this idea of organizing by geography by about 200 years. And specifically with the printing press, there was no longer a monopoly on hand-copied, handwritten books. And so knowledge became more distributed. And people began to ask questions about what's the best way of organizing? Maybe this king isn't necessarily divine from a deity. Maybe we can actually have representatives. Maybe we can actually organize either as republics or representative democracies. And about 200 years later, the Treaty of Westphalia and the idea that sovereignty is defined by geographical borders. Now, at the same time, we're now facing a new era in which through the internet, there's questions about what is real, what is fake, what is real trustworthy news, who can you work to. In some respects, we've created a very transparent society that is very flattened. But with that flattening, the question is, who can you go to have a sense of what really is going on? And so should we not be surprised that just like the printing press gave rise to new questions about how we should organize, will not the internet also raise interesting questions about how and best we can work together as societies? We're going to see more change in the next 7 years than the last 20 years combined. That's not linear change, that is exponential change, and it continues to accelerate. So that's why we need this idea of leaders who are willing to illuminate the way. And any one of you can be a change agent. All I ask is that you have a strategy for how you're going to manage friction. We often confuse the difference between management and leadership. Management is when you do what's expected of you by your boss, your peers, or your reports. And we all need to do that to a degree. In some cases, we also need to do what's expected from us by the public or by our representatives. But if you are willing to step out of leadership, you need to recognize that the root of the word leadership comes from the word leet, which means to be sent unto death. Because back in ancient Greece, the leets were the ones that carried the flag in front of the army. And that's all well and good until one army meets another army, and who's the first to die? The flag bearers, the leets. So you need to have a strategy for how you're going to manage the friction caused by this world we're facing. So there are questions that we're going to raise in this panel, and I'll just tee them up. What does the future of machine learning, neural networks, and AI mean for the future of work, of jobs? Will there be more jobs created or destroyed, and will those jobs be available to everybody, or will we be facing some form of neo-feudalism in which there are serfs, there are vassals, and then there are lords and ladies? Will geographical borders increasingly matter less in this era of the internet? Can civic governments keep up with the rate of change? These are all questions that we don't have the luxury of 20 years. As I said, the next 7 years are going to see more change than the last 2 decades. This is happening now. So let me give you some optimistic projections as to what we can do based on what I've seen. When I arrived at the FCC in late 2013, there had been 9 chief information officers in 10 years, which is always a good sign for the next CIO that things are just going great. And we wanted to actually do something that in the past, we've been paying people to volunteer their broadband speeds to see if they were really getting the broadband speeds that were promised to them by the commercial sector. And we wanted to make this an app that they could actually download, and if they wanted to, on their phone, test their broadband speed and share it with the government if they wanted. But you can imagine saying, hi, I'm with the US government. Would you like to download an app that'll look at your broadband connection and share the results? Probably not going to be too successful. However, we did privacy by design. And what we did was we made the code open source, and we made it available for anyone to see what the code did. We made it so the terms and conditions were only 2 pages long, and when was the last time you downloaded anything from the internet where the terms and conditions were only 2 pages long? And if you looked at the code, and not everyone did, but those who were experts did, we didn't know what your IP address was, and we didn't know who you were in a 5-mile radius. Privacy by design. It ended up being the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome for a while on the iOS store. So it shows that the civic body is interested and passionate about helping collect data that can inform making their neighborhoods healthier or safer or better to live in, if they can also trust that their data will be kept anonymous and private. This also gets to the question of remixability. How many people are familiar with Crisis Commons? If you're not, I would recommend you take a look at it. Basically, when the earthquakes happened in Haiti, people were willing to use their SMS flip phones to share data of what they were seeing. They would say, power lines were down here, we need hospital beds over here, and they sort of crowdsourced a response to that disaster. And there was actually a case in which 2 individuals, sisters, one of which was pregnant, They were actually trying to make their way to a hospital. And along the way, she was using SMS to update her social media and share where they were. And they were saying, the sister's going into labor. We can't cross this bridge because it's down. And what actually happened was the US Navy actually saw those feeds through Crisis Commons and was able actually to dispatch a team to meet them and bring them back to the hospital ship and successfully give birth. So there's this idea of crowdsourcing as opposed to things that used to have to be done either by government agencies or centralized nonprofits. Now, again, we're here to talk about AI, and so I won't dive in too much, but this may sound a little bit curious just to see how far we've gone. 2013, there was a competition on Kaggle to see if anyone could write an AI that would actually grade papers as good as a third grade teacher. Same grammar mistakes, same sentence problems, same things that needed to be corrected. And for $60,000, someone won that competition. 2014, Xerox comes out with a copier that will take handwritten questions, handwritten answers, and grade it for the teacher. 2015, we know that different AIs are being tested to see which meetings you should go to, which meetings you should not go to, and if you do go to those meetings, who should you take with you? There's also a case where actually a board of directors elected an algorithm and gave it voting rights. And now, most recently in the United States, 2016, a competition to see if anyone can write an AI that can answer real estate law questions as good as a lawyer. And right now, it's about 70% accurate. This is the rate of the change that we're seeing in the world. Finally, how many of you are familiar with the makers movement? If you're not, I highly recommend, because while we're talking about data, you also need to recognize that what's happening in the physical world matters too. It's this idea that people have access to inexpensive technologies that were only available to nation states or large corporations 10 to 15 years ago. Over there, you see 3 individuals who actually, for less than $60 using a Raspberry Pi device, built a urine-powered generator so they could actually read at night and continue their schooling. On the other side, for less than 60 bucks, using a SMS flip phone, they produced a baby monitor that can send 20 different vital signs anywhere in the world to any doctor. That's exponential change at increasing availability and affordability unprecedented in human history. Now, at the same time, the terrorist attacks in Mumbai also used web search, also used GPS, also used social media, unfortunately, to plan the attacks and figure out who they wanted to execute. Technology is amoral. It's how we choose how to use it that determines whether it's good or bad. And this is increasingly where people are getting access to capabilities that were unparalleled and only available to nation states less than 2 decades ago. We are all becoming super empowered. The question is, what does that mean for human societies? This is a photo of Ensign Nimitz with the US Navy, who in 1904 ran his boat aground in the Philippines and was court-martialed, but not drummed out of the Navy, and 35 years later became one of only 2 5-star admirals that helped us win the war in the Pacific in World War II. Now imagine nowadays a young ensign or lieutenant with the US Navy runs their boat aground. How long on Twitter, how long on Facebook and other social media would have been fire Nimitz? Probably would have been called before Congress and his boss as well, and they would have been drummed out of the Navy and would have lost a future 5-star admiral. I celebrate that we're becoming more transparent and open as societies, but we may also be becoming more risk-averse or tolerant of those who make mistakes in their career. And then finally, to give you a sense of the change, we use Internet Protocol version 4. We've used it for the last 20 years to find addresses on the internet. That was 4.3 billion numbers, and we ran out of that about 18 months ago. If we take the Internet Protocol version 4, which was 4.3 billion numbers, and put it into a beach ball, all those numbers, we're now adopting what's called Internet Protocol version 6 around the world, which is 2 to the 128th numbers. Any guesses as to what the relative size of the internet compared to the internet that you knew was the beach ball, the size of the internet when it comes to Internet Protocol version 6? The internet you knew was the beach ball. The internet you will know over the next 5 years is the size of the sun. That's not linear change. That is exponential change. So I'll leave you with the closing thought before we go to additional speaker and then the panel, which is Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you ever know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Thank you for being positive change agents. I look forward to future discussions. And now I'll let the next speaker be introduced. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Impeccable timing. So I'd like to introduce Ken Finnegan. Ken is Chief Technology Advisor for the IDA Ireland, and he is the provider of strategic insights into technology trends, both nationally and globally for the IDA and for their client companies. Ken is going to talk to us about Ireland's AI opportunity and shaping the right environment.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't see my presentation popping up there. One thing about the amount of numbers that we heard there, it's kind of hard to get your head around the numbers. What I like about, my favorite expression about the Internet of Things is like, it's a great solution, but nobody really knows what the problem is yet. Anyway, I'm here to talk about artificial intelligence. As Chief Technologist in the IDA for the past three years, I want to tell you why companies come to Ireland and invest in artificial intelligence. There are two main reasons for investments that I hear every day, and that's access to skills and a vibrant ecosystem to work in. So what do I mean by skills, and what are the skills that are in demand? Earlier this year, IDA was propositioned by a client company and one of the largest technology companies in the world to develop a national master's in artificial intelligence. The message is clear that there is a shortage of AI expertise globally, and if Ireland could establish a national master's in AI, we could really position ourselves as a core strategic location for AI investment and job creation. The global demand for AI skills is intense. However, we need to engage with the entire industry and not just one company to verify this. So, in early May, IDA Ireland, Enterprise Ireland and Science Foundation Ireland ran a design-led workshop to define these goals. One of the goals was to benchmark the capability that exists in artificial in Ireland currently, and the second was to determine a strategic direction and areas in where we can lead from an AI perspective. The event was attended by 60 thought leaders from industry, including multinationals, Irish companies, as well as prominent and esteemed academics, including Barry O'Sullivan, who will be on the panel after this, social innovators, and even union representatives. One of the messages that was crystal clear was the need for skilled employees in AI from everybody in the room. This included skilled workers in machine learning, advanced analytics, computer vision processing, natural language programming, and other related disciplines that echo their clients' needs. To this end, in less than 2 weeks, we're going to begin a process to develop a national master's in artificial intelligence guided by industry needs. We plan to have 2 streams online by next year, one stream for the academic year 2018-19, and a second to be delivered earlier in the year, which will focus on upskilling employees from industry. Finally, let me talk about the ecosystem. Ireland is home to 10 of the top 10 internet companies, born on the internet companies, 9 of the top 10 global software companies, 8 of the top 10 global biopharmaceutical companies, and many more spanning multiple industries. As you can see behind me, these are just some of the companies that are involved in AI work here in Ireland. There's a great mix of multinational and indigenous company with AI capability here. IBM, for example, have the largest software function outside of the States based here in Ireland, and the strategic focus on their AI platform Watson, cognitive IoT, interactive reasoning, integrated health and social care, and much more. IBM employ 3,000 people here in Ireland. Another great demonstration of the capability is the Irish growing company Movidius. Movidius developed their own processing architecture designed specifically with large-scale numerical workloads in image and signal processing, using parallelism in order to achieve programming methodology and architecture that achieves a sweet spot for them for their family of vision processing chips. Last year, Movidius was acquired by Intel and continues to embellish the AI ecosystem in Ireland. Another demonstration of credibility and capability comes from Accenture. Accenture, the DOC, is a multidisciplinary and incubation hub, home to 200 designers, developers, and experts in artificial intelligence, analytics, and IoT. The DOC is where ideas are investigated and brought to life. Their state-of-the-art facility allows them to collaborate and co-create with clients, universities, and startups. In 2015, Accenture opened a new global technology lab with a specific focus in artificial intelligence. These are just some of the companies that are doing great work here, but an ecosystem is more than just companies. There is an abundance of meetups, hackathons, incubators, accelerators, adding to this rich tapestry of AI in Ireland. For example, we have Dublin AI, the machine learning meetup in Dublin, NLP meetups, Cork Virtual Reality, Dark Cork, Agile Lean meetup in Galway, Quark.js, Limerick open source, and so forth. If you log into meetup.com and look for tech meetups in Ireland, you'll be blown away by the activity. Also, where there's a lot of activity, there's also a lot of investors. And we've seen substantial increase in investment over the past 5 years in foreign direct investment, 2016 being one of the most successful years for job creation in the history of the state. Finally, underpinning the ecosystem is world-class research. Government allocated 761 million in research and development in 2016. This is the third year in a row that funding has increased and represents a 3.2 increase on 2015. The Minister for Training and Skills, Minister Halligan, has stated that Ireland's future economic and prosperity will depend in a very large measure on our continued investment in research, development and innovation. This investment is all about developing a competitive knowledge-based economy and a society, driving innovation in enterprise, building human capital, and in maximising the return on research and development investment for economic and social progress. On the screen are some of the world-class centres of scale here in Ireland that have an AI focus. Research range from microelectronics and key enabling technologies for AI to high-performance computing, advanced analytics, future of networks, and communications and software. There are multiple government supports to enable industry to leverage the range of expertise coming from the universities and research centres. If anybody would like to find out more, please don't hesitate to get in contact with IDA Ireland. When it comes to the revolution in Ireland, Ireland has been preparing for 60 years to continue to deliver. We are small enough to trial, large enough to prove, and capable to deliver products and services at a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Jeff Brown, Associate General Counsel, Microsoft. Jeff. Catherine Watson, Senior Manager, Technology and Strategy, Accenture. We have Bryson Kaler, Chief Technology Officer, IBM Watson. We have Professor Barry O'Sullivan, Director of the Insight Centre for Data Analytics, and Dr. David Bray, who has just spoken. Round of applause, please, for our panel. Okay, so we're going to start off with a question. In terms of artificial intelligence, what opportunities are there for AI to improve society? And I'll start with Bryson.
Wow, it's such an exciting time to be talking about all of this. It's just been great. I think the opportunity for AI to help society understand all of the data that is around us, I fundamentally look at it as how do we help people make smarter decisions? How do we help a person decide the right thing for them to do at any given moment? Whether that's a healthcare related decision, whether that is a lifestyle decision, whether that is a safety decision, right? Understanding what's going to happen, what is happening, what has happened, and what the future holds, and bringing that together.
Okay, very good. Catherine?
Just to build on what Bryce said, I think it's a really exciting time for AI to be a force for good. And for me, it's about how we augment humans and solve some of the challenging issues that humanity faces today. So how do we tackle the big issues like incurable diseases and climate change?
Okay, perfect. Let's move to another question. In terms of threats, what is the greatest challenge? Jeff, over to you.
Well, I
You're a lawyer,
totally agree.
You will know.
I know I'm the lawyer, so I have to bring things down. I'm also very excited about the potential for artificial intelligence, but we've got to get the regulation right. And I'd point to three things. First is, in interpreting the GDPR, how will principles like data minimization, restrictions on automated decision-making be implemented in the GDPR? And then going forward, how will the e-privacy regulation impact artificial intelligence? Will we empower artificial intelligence in an ethical way? Or could we have a bit of another legal artificial intelligence winter?
Okay, thank you. And Barry, what do you think in terms of future challenge?
Well, I think, in the context of the GDPR, one of the big challenges obviously is the whole question of explanation and building trust in AI systems. So that is becoming a huge challenge, and not just because the GDPR requires that, but it is also the right thing to do. We're building some incredibly sophisticated systems that are not transparent. We know that deep learning can drive, can implement a self-driving car, but we don't know what it is that it understands about driving. So explanation is a big issue. And I suppose the other question is, how is AI going to impact society? So, David in his talk mentioned, the impact on jobs. And so, what happens in a situation where we potentially will automate, a large number of jobs? There's some evidence to suggest that those jobs will be replaced with other jobs, but if you look at fields like manufacturing, that really hasn't actually happened. So I think these are, on the one side, there is just the trustworthiness and accessibility, on the other side is the societal impact. I think these are the big challenges.
And I hear that lawyers will be the first to be replaced by AI.
Well, that's already happened.
They're 30% now, so a little bit more time.
They said that wasn't
non-routine lawyers may still have a job, but the routine ones.
So these guys did it, right?
Okay, so you're safe, Jeff. Okay. So just moving on, David, maybe you could touch on ethical challenges and considerations.
Sure. So I think it's important to recognize that with machine learning, neural networks, and AI, the way we're doing it right now, it's not formal AI, it's more the bottoms up where we're exposing it to enough data, much like you would expose a 5-year-old to enough data. And at a certain point in time, a 5-year-old starts speaking and says, I'm going to run to school today, but we didn't explicitly say subject, verb, object. And when you ask them why did they say it that way, they just say, well, that's because I heard it in the past. So I think we need to be cautious because as we look for explanations as to why an automated decision is made, the answer will probably go back to the data. And there's actually an app called FaceApp, which is an interesting app that had a bit of a challenge that in the last month or two, if you hit beautify, unfortunately, it would make anybody's skin, it would take a photo of you, it would make anybody's skin tone lighter, which as we know is objectively wrong. But unfortunately, that's what the data had been trained against with the machine, and the machine had made a false conclusion that to be beautified meant lighter skin, which is obviously anathema. I share that because we may need to start thinking about, do we need the equivalent of like data ombudsmans that are looking at the data that's being used and seeing, is this data, one, representative of what we want to expose the machine to? Is it diverse? And is the machine making spurious correlations from the data that we need to correct? And so that's a question about openness we need to think about going forward.
So you mentioned, David, the 5-year-old and AI, and as a cyber psychologist, and in terms of vulnerable populations online, particularly children, it's a specific area of interest for me. So in the context of the ethical interface between the child and AI, just to bounce it to you, Barry, in terms of GDPR and digital age of consent, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. One of the important decisions that we have to take, as a state in the next number of weeks or months is, do we go with the default of a 16 digital age of consent, or do we, essentially follow the COPA legislation in the US and set it at 13? And this is not, this is not a trivial question. And I think
we in Ireland specifically.
We in Ireland specifically, and I think this really has to be something that's evidence-based. This is a very significant decision. Not all 13-year-olds, not all 14-year-olds are, equally capable and aware of what's going on and what the consequences are. So this is a huge issue, and it's an ethical challenge to the government and to us as a society in terms of what do we really want here. So it's a major issue.
And I think, just back to you in terms of the legal and ethical challenges, the legal challenges of a child interfacing with artificial intelligence. Where does the duty of care, first of all, and then the legal responsibility lie? I mean, the AI doesn't know it's a child, which is the whole age verification issue.
The AI doesn't know it's a child, and what I think the law can do is it can put up an infrastructure in which ethical decisions are incented and made. And so we've been thinking about ethical review boards. I haven't thought of it in terms of ombudsperson, but that's an interesting approach. And I would assume that if we had data of a child or somebody who was in the teen years, we would be more focused on these issues in that kind of a review. And it's an interesting question. Are you reviewing the algorithm? Are you reviewing the data that's going into the algorithm? Mm-hmm. Those are the questions that I think that the law should be incenting companies and all data controllers to think about.
So Bryson, do you think Watson can help out?
I think we have to, it's very early days, right? And we are all experimenting constantly. And I think we need to make sure that we balance having enough room for that experimentation to occur. with clear things like making sure that 13-year-olds or 16-year-olds or what does minors actually mean. Like there are some clear places where we need to have great legislation, and there's some clear places where I think we need to make sure that we allow for this to evolve, because we're not putting the machines in charge. The machines are helping us understand data, giving us insight. Humans are still interpreting that and deciding what to do with it or not, and still a piece of the puzzle of how we actually take this and turn it into applications or turn it into a decision that is made. And I don't want to clamp down too quickly, because we don't know how these algorithms are going to change over time. We don't know how the data sets are going to change over time. And so I encourage us to, to have some patience as the algorithms are young and immature, and they're going to do silly things, like the photo, example. Yeah, that's a really silly thing. Okay, it made a mistake. They need to fix it.
You don't get chances to do silly things around kids. That's the problem.
No, which is why I said that, there are cases where it's very clear, and there are some areas where I think we need to continue to allow the freedom of experimentation to take place.
There's a very fundamental thing that we haven't really discussed in any great detail. David briefly mentioned it, and that's the whole question of bias in AI. Mm-hmm. I often describe AI systems as bias in, bias out. Right? So the reason AI has sort of taken off in some sense for the last number of years is because of the availability of large amounts of data. AI today is as much about data science and data analytics as it is about good old-fashioned AI, from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The availability of compute cycles, and I suppose what is one of the least transparent techniques, which is deep learning. And I suppose we really do have to understand. We really have to look at what kinds of bias can we fall foul of here. Obviously, the data bias is a problem. But there's, something you've written about in terms of filter bubbles and, the impact of technology on segmenting society. These are things we need to worry about. Interaction biases, like how do we train systems? So Watson, in some sense, how is its behavior and its knowledge going to change over time? The whole concept of bias is something that we really need to get our heads around, because it's so key to, the successful delivery of these systems.
Well, if we talk about artificial intelligence as sort of a circular argument in terms of, as behavioral scientists, we barely understand how human intelligence works so the premise of actually creating something to replicate that is a little bit of a false premise. I mean, personally, I prefer to think of artificial intelligence in the area of intelligence amplification or intelligence augmentation, and keep the human at the center of the process. Catherine, from an industry perspective, what's your take on that?
So I think there's a good point around how legislation needs to evolve, but also organisational governance needs to evolve as well, and there needs to be inbuilt from the start the right responsible and ethical framework that evolves as the technology evolves as well, which is really important, because things are going to exponentially change and develop, and those guardrails need to flex and adapt as that happens.
Yeah, we've seen David's metaphors, the beach ball to the sun, they resonate. We've time for one or two quick questions from the audience. So is there anybody in the audience that has a question for the panel?
They don't know. I'll toss out something. So if there is a question, we can go.
Is there somebody there?
No, doesn't look like. So I'll just toss out a few thoughts that first, according to the Pew Internet Survey, the average teenager, at least in the United States, has 11 different internet personas, only 2 of which their parents know about. So that is the first challenge, is a lot of these personas may not be known. The other challenge is, and it's actually a little bit of a hope as well, at least in the US, obscenity laws predated privacy laws by about 80 years. And you think about it, law is always catching up with technology. In some respects, that's what it should be doing. But it was only when we started moving into industrial areas that suddenly someone said, well, wait a minute. When I look out my window, do I necessarily want to see certain things? And so obscenity laws were put into place. And it wasn't until the 1970s, when you had what was called at the time automated data processing, that people actually started thinking about, well, what correlations might you make that are wrong? Or maybe are things that actually were not, you gave privilege to share. So it may very well be that a new set of law, I've heard in Scandinavia and other places are talking about what they call, you have the right to the integrity of both your physical and your digital presence. Mm-hmm. There may be something that is beyond privacy that is really part of the conversation here. The last thing that I'll leave as sort of an optimistic note as well is there's this advance called homomorphic encryption. And what that is basically the ability to actually match things while still in an encrypted state. And there is advances being made in that area. But if you think about that, that in some respects allows us to have greater privacy because all you're doing is seeing if you find matches on the encrypted data without revealing the identity of the individual. And so that may be a way to focus on behaviors without revealing who the person is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I worry in terms of the encryption debate, how we can actually, as a society, deliver on collective security when there are domains that will be effectively beyond the law, and that's going to be challenging. And at the same time, maintain the vitality of the tech industry.
Yeah, so from a Watson perspective, we've been making sure that we have a very robust data tagging perspective so that the base models of everything we've learned from image or speech or natural language can be separated from the data that an individual customer or company would bring in. They're adding intelligence to that model, the training and the learning that Watson has based upon your data, but I don't want to then take that learning and apply it back into the base. So we've done a lot of work to make sure that the base model can then allow for individualized learning on top without it then filtering back down and being a base part of it. Because it's really important that the intelligence we teach the machine over time, there's a difference between what it's learned from what you know as an individual company from what we've gathered from public data.
I just want to throw out one thought. We know that one particular search entity is moving from basic algorithmic structure into deep learning. And even the engineers that actively work on it are the first to admit that they will lose control. So what does the panel think about this thought of something so powerful losing control?
So I think if we're referring to the same company that remain anonymous, it's losing control in a sense that it's not losing control over the goals of the machine. Goals are still being set by the machine. So while I heard, earlier we were talking about we get our references from science fiction and movies, I think in some respects that's actually a disservice because as far as I know, we've not written a machine that can set its own goals beyond the initial super goal. I mean, the only way it knows how to do things is it weights towards that goal. So that's the humans. But there is a case where that company has seen with their translation services what's an emergent behavior, so something that was not expected, which is they thought for every language pairing in their translation, they'd have to teach the machine each time, unique language pairing. And what they found out is no, actually, there apparently is, surprise, surprise, a sort of digital Esperanto to how humans talk. And they don't need to train the machine each time. And this is an emergent behavior that was not expected, and they're scratching their heads as to why. So I think what we need to be prepared for is emergent surprises. But in terms of the machine taking itself over and saying, okay, I'm no longer going to be driving your car, I'm now going to focus on taking over the world, that would only happen if a human programmed it. Now that gets to the last point I want to leave, which is we humans are fundamentally flawed. As Barry mentioned, we are incredibly biased. We know we make poor decisions. I mean, there should be no correlation between someone's height and the amount of money they earn as a chief financial officer, but there is. And I raise that because it may very be, the taller you are, the more you earn. Hate to say it. But that said, we could actually begin to use the machine to hold up to ourselves a digital reflection and say, are you aware of, in making hiring decisions, you are picking people of this type or this look, and is that fair? Right. And so in some respects, this might be a way to hold up a mirror to ourselves and realize our own biases as human beings.
But it's actually very difficult to deal with some of these things. Like if you look at natural language, there's a very interesting paper that was published in Science recently that looked at the inherent bias in language, for example. And so things like if you study text from a word embedding point of view, so just think of it as, how close are certain words to some other words, you tend to find that in almost every language that male words are associated with positions of leadership and dominance, and female phrases tend to be associated with caring and more subservient roles. And this is really a baked-in bias in the way we communicate with each other. And so when systems try to learn from this, then they are learning from something that's fundamentally biased. And it's very difficult to get over this.
So just a final thought to wrap up. What will AI be accountable to? Where will governance lie? David's dying to answer.
Yes, but I'll go last. I'll let others go first.
Okay, Jeff, one-liner.
It's accountable to society. I mean, when we see these patterns that we didn't expect in how people use language, I've seen some of the same research, but other research that shows, does a male pronoun come before a female pronoun? the fact that AI and other kinds of analysis can figure that out is something that helps society correct itself.
Okay.
I think organisations need to plan for unintended consequences, and the only way to kind of mitigate and balance that is through human-centred design, and really having humans at the centre of it and having the organisation and governance around it.
I think consumers will vote, because as businesses leverage AI in their products, in their offerings, in their services, and how they deliver what they're doing, whether they do that in a good way or in a poor way is going to be reflective of whether or not people use those products and services. And so it will have a self-regulating mechanism, because as society, we do that already. We're just now, instead of how did that cashier treat me, how did that clerk treat me, how did my doctor treat me, the machine now is influencing some of that as well, and I'm going to take that into account with the business that I'm doing, working with.
Yeah, it isn't obvious to me how we can govern AI, because what certainly isn't going to happen, there isn't going to be a UN committee set up for monitoring AI, right? That's not going to happen. And if one buys into AI as an augmentation, no, I didn't. I know you didn't. Absolutely, I know you didn't.
No, I said don't ever say never.
Oh no, never. Well, I think on this one, I'm happy to go never on this one. But I think this is, if you buy into AI as augmenting and extending the human being, then it comes down to a value system. So we as a society, globally as human beings, how do we actually want to interact with each other, and what kind of natural, so almost game theoretic behaviors are there to incentivize us to behave in certain ways. So I think we will have to rely on that, on a mechanism like that.
And David?
So I'll try to stitch together what everyone said, because I agree actually with every point that was said, which is, if we recognize that first and foremost that we humans actually have flawed programming from our evolutionary background. Face it, we only ran into 80 people for most of our lives as a species for our ancestors, and that was in our entire lifespan that were our family members. And most of you have probably met more than 80 people today, so we're in a completely different environment than what our brains are fairly wired for. That said, we actually had this thing called the professions. How do you know you can trust a doctor is going to behave ethically even though you're not an expert in what the doctor does? How do you know a lawyer is going to behave ethically even though you're not an expert? Or a professor? And it's the idea that as long as you self-police yourselves, we consider the law, we consider doctors, we consider academics to be a profession that will police themselves, and if they don't, then we as society take the right away from them self-policing themselves. And that's why you don't see, where there is a bar association or a group of tenured professors, you don't see in business per se the same idea that those are professions as opposed to the law or medicine or professors. So I think we're going to see two possible futures, which is, can AI demonstrate it will self-police itself? And so public is willing to let that be happening. And if not, they'll pull back.
Excellent. Well, I think that the panel has demonstrated there's a lot of deep thinking going on about AI, and I feel confident that collectively we will certainly be successful in terms of our adoption and increasing adoption of AI. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.